Joining us now is Nick Nyhart. Nick is a co-founder and the president and CEO of Public Campaign. He's a 3-decade veteran of social change politics, issue advocacy, grassroots organizing, and nonprofit management. At Public Campaign, he works to win cutting-edge state reform efforts across the country and has organized a number of national collaborations toward that same goal as well. And he is contributing editor of a new and important report entitled Democracy at a Crossroads, How the 1% is Silencing Our Voices. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So, okay, we know the 1% has a lot of influence. We know democracy is at a crossroads. What does this report tell us beyond that we need to know? What specifics should people be worrying about right now?
So I think this report for the first time catalogs a whole lot of aspects of democracy and attacks on democracy that have been seen as separate. Attacks on the right to organize for everyday workers, to organize in a union and speak up politically as a union. It looks at the assaults on voting rights, and it also looks at the changes in our campaign finance system that have allowed billionaires to be so much more powerful than everyday people. And in a democracy, you just can't have that. And it looks at those assaults at 3 different levels: at the Supreme Court, in the states, and at the federal level, especially in Congress. So it ties all that together, and it's important we see this as a whole, because if we see it as an assault on democracy that's strategically thought about together, I think our response then brings in more people, brings them in together, and helps us fight what really needs to be fought, which is the diminution of every voice, and instead greater power, not to the 1%, but you're really talking the 1% of the 1% here.
Right, absolutely. And so let me kind of synthesize what you just said and offer a thought, and please, Nick, tell me what you think of it. And that would be that I think of these issues in terms of empowerment versus disempowerment psychologically, first of all, before we even organize. So if I sit here and 10 million and 100 million other Americans sit in their separate rooms and think the 1% or the 0.1% run everything, I've got no voice in what happens, I'm up against a huge shapeless monster in the dark that's faster than I will ever be, I feel helpless and afraid and discouraged. But if I think, well, no, it's doing these sorts of things in my state capitol, it's doing these sorts of things in the Supreme Court chambers, it's doing these sorts of things on Capitol Hill, then I get a kind of lay of the land, and I know what needs to be done, and then I can start looking for groups that are kind of addressing those issues. Is that a fair way of kind of processing what your report does?
Yeah, I think so. I think people feel stronger when they stand together, and they know they're united with other people thinking the same thing. As we've rolled out this report and presented it to audiences, one interesting result is someone may know a lot about voting rights, understand that struggle, but they haven't seen the parallels to union organizing battles or to the big battles we face on money and politics. The second thing, in additional to feeling connected with other groups in the same situation, I think you can begin to take heart in victories. So local victories on voting rights, for instance, recently in Maryland, or on money and politics last November in Seattle and in Maine. People can look for victories in every different part of that and feel like we're moving ahead together.
Yeah, I think that's so important, because I think that, sort of the possibility of change begins with understanding that there is a possibility of change, if that makes sense. And let's talk about voting rights for a second. Let's start there, since that's one of the legs of this report. I'm not sure people fully understand the extent to which, or a lot of people fully understand the extent to which there is a nationwide, and especially in certain key states, southern states and elsewhere, effort to disenfranchise people who might vote against the 0.1%, to systematically an effort to disenfranchise. I mean, your report talks about that a little, so tell us a little about that.
So interesting, because that brings up where all 3 of these elements come into play in terms of the pushback from people who don't want more people to vote. They want fewer people to vote. So we counted up, and there were in 49 states, all but one of them, there were conservative efforts in legislatures to reduce voting rights. They didn't succeed, thank God, in all states, but they succeeded in a number of them. At the same time, you have the Supreme Court making a ruling that says, you know what, that Voting Rights Act went too far, and it was based on old Southern segregationist patterns of passing laws. So they got rid of an important part of the Voting Rights Act that said states that have had historic patterns of segregation in voting rights need to pre-clear that with the Justice Department if they want to make any changes. The Supreme Court said, you know, that's old stuff, doesn't happen anymore. So they got rid of this key section that gives those states where there's been a pattern of historic discrimination much more ability to squeeze down who gets to vote. And you see then states taking advantage of it. And Congress, because the Supreme Court didn't say this is unconstitutional, they just said Congress needs to update this before we can do anything. And then Congress gridlocks on the issue, and the chair of the committee, Bob Goodlatte, where this a revised Voting Rights Act would go through, is sitting on his hands and won't even have a hearing. And so you see people's right to vote diminished by actions on all three on part of the Supreme Court, Congress, and then what we're seeing in the states. And essentially you have politicians picking the voters, not voters picking the politicians.
Absolutely. We're talking with Nick Nyhart, who is a president and CEO of Public Campaign. So, you know, and one of the things that I think it's important for people to understand as they watch, for example, the atrocity of depriving Americans of the right to vote is that when the original Voting Rights Act was passed in the 1960s, if I recall correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, it had considerable Republican support. This was, at that point in history, it wasn't nearly the partisan issue it is today, where you have one party, in this case, essentially trying to suppress the right of millions of Americans to vote. Am I right about that?
You're right about that. Things are more polarized, essentially among the politicians. When you actually poll and find out where ordinary Americans stand, you'll find on provisions like allowing people to vote early or vote on Sunday, they're broadly popular. And on money in politics, no one in America practically thinks the campaign finance system is working, and no one wants the billionaires to have more power in that system. So it's true that it's polarized at the congressional level and in many state houses, but among the American people, it isn't polarized. People want their voice heard. As a matter of fact, Public Campaign recently changed its name to Every Voice because it stands for what we want, that every voice is heard. And that's something, you know, Americans of every political stripe agree with. My voice ought to get heard fairly and squarely, and it shouldn't be up to a tiny handful of a few people to run our country.
And you know, you find that same kind of difference between voters and elected officials, particularly on the Republican side, whether you're talking about Social Security or Medicare or banking issues, restraining Wall Street, and so on. You find that I once wrote a piece saying that if Republican voters ran this country, we'd have a much more progressive country than we do, even under Democrats, because Republican voters do have, by and large, a majority of them have pretty reasonable views on a lot of issues. So again, the disconnect between elected officials, including, I would say, some Democrats as well, but the disconnect between elected officials and the voters themselves, that really has to do with what we're talking about here, right? That has to do with the distorting effect of money in the political process.
Right, and 2 points in where you can see that. One is in Maine, which is a state that has had its lawmakers switch back and forth between being Republican-led and Democratic-led. And in Maine, initiative passed 55 to 45 to strengthen their small donor-based public financing law called the Clean Elections Law. There were sitting Republican lawmakers who backed that and spoke up publicly for it, and certainly they wouldn't have won by the margin they did if Republicans were against that at the polls. So there certainly is grassroots Republican support for this kind of change, and even some very brave Republican officials who are now supporting these kinds of changes. At the federal level, I think in the presidential race, you've seen incredible evidence that Americans are angry and want change in their political system, are tired of the Washington establishment, are tired of politicians who don't listen to them, and rules that rig the system against them. So it's, you know, the surge for Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party, and Donald Trump surging ahead very unexpectedly for both of them, I think. is due to the fact that people are so discontent they don't want to vote for people who've been seen as symbols of the political establishment for years.
Yeah, and I always try to be clear when I comment on Bernie Sanders that I'm on Team Bernie, but I guess I would say that the other, I think one of the noteworthy things about what you just said is that when you disenfranchise people to a certain extent, it can turn into a drive for change, which is what I would argue that Bernie Sanders represents, or a turn towards demagoguery, which is what I would argue Donald Trump represents. So I think that's why it's so important to channel this drive, this dissatisfaction, this understanding that people don't have enough of a voice in our democracy toward constructive ends.
Right?
Does that make
So
sense to you?
yes, it does. And one of the key things is the politicians not just rage about how unfair the system is and how ordinary people like you aren't heard, and you can hear that in people's speeches, but they actually talk about solutions. In other words, if there's secret money in politics, are we going to be for disclosure? If big donors have too much power, what can we do to elevate the role of small donors? And so on. So I think what's really important when we pressed candidates to do this election season is to talk about where they actually stand on the issues so people know the solutions are out there. If the political class is silent about solutions, people are going to give up hope. So having state and local victories is one way to get those solutions on the table, but having political leadership, having people as they run for office speak up about the changes they would make is another way of displaying leadership and giving people hope.
We're talking with Nick Nyhart, President and CEO of Public Campaign. I guess before we pivot to solutions completely, I guess I would ask you: is there anything in the report we haven't discussed that people should know about it?
Well, I think the other thing it goes into is looking at who are the forces allied on the other side. And not surprisingly, the forces on the other side are deep pocket special interests and a cadre of billionaires. So the Koch brothers stand out. For instance, when you think about the Supreme Court, the three of the biggest cases, the voting rights case that I mentioned, Citizens United, and one case that was moving up it was just heard in January, the Friedrichs case against the teachers union in California, all of which would have diminished ordinary people's power, all these cases. The Koch brothers, for instance, funded the legal institutes and think tanks that brought all those cases forward. So there is an enemy behind this, and this is not all billionaires by any means, but there are a select few who are sort of formed a political raptor class, if you will, that is intent on not just having power, but having more power and diminishing the power of everyday Americans. So I think that's the other piece.
I'm sure you saw the article, the interview with, I believe it was Charles Koch, saying that he really didn't like all the negative commentary that was being directed his way. And my thought is, if you try to hijack the democracy of a nation of 320 million people, a lot of people are going to have feelings about it, and they're going to be largely negative. So I think you might want to get used to that. So let's talk a little bit about some of the solutions. You mentioned Maine. You mentioned that some of our states, some of our cities, Seattle, voting to get money out of politics. That seems to me promising in a way. These local initiatives, because it seems to me, with a couple notable exceptions, that when people get prominent in national politics, when they're senators or presidents or whatever, by and large, they're pretty deeply invested in the system as it currently exists. There are some exceptions. But I guess what I would ask is, people should read your report. I would say Democracy at the Crossroads. But what should people do? Where should they go? What should they know about how to mobilize to change this situation?
Well, in mid-April, there are two huge demonstrations culminating in a mid-April rally. They can go to democracyawakening.org and find out how to participate. It's focused in D.C. Preceding that, there's another action called Democracy Spring that's actually going to march from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. to also stage protests. So there's going to be about the first 2 weeks of April are going to be full of mobilizing people to speak out against the unfair system, culminating in a weekend in Washington, and people really bringing a very fierce and firm message to Congress that we need change. So they can get involved in that, democracyawakening.org and democracyspring.org. They can find out more. So that's important. But back at home, they can get involved in efforts to find out where your state legislature is on voting rights, get involved there. The Democracy Initiative, people can also go to that website, is sort of a clearinghouse that brings together voting rights activists, campaign finance reform activists, together with environmentalists, labor unions, civil rights activists, to figure out how we can make progress on these issues together. So the Democracy Initiative is doing that. In the coming year, we'll see other local efforts where people in cities and states, again, like they did in Seattle and Maine, are going to stand up and change the law in their own neighborhood where they live. So those are all ways people can get involved. If they want to read more, democracycrossroads.org, they can read our full report there.
Okay, well, this is great work. This is very, very important that people know and understand this and feel optimistic about it. So Nick Nyhart, President and CEO of Every Voice Center, formerly known as Public Campaign, thanks so much for joining us.